Hi class, welcome back, and this is the third presentation for Module 1. And the purpose of this module is to show how to measure GDP using the spending approach. You recall from the first presentation for Module 1 that I mentioned that there are three approaches for measuring GDP. There's the income approach, there's the value-added approach, and the spending approach. And in this presentation I'm going to go into detail about the spending approach. Here are some of the key points I'm going to try to get across in this presentation. The first point is what are the four sectors of the economy and what are their corresponding spending components. The second point I want to get across is the relationship between output and spending. There's an equation I'm going to show you that you're going to see throughout the semester. And then I want to talk about the different types of consumer spending, the different types of investment spending, spending on intermediate goods and services, as well as the different types of government spending, as well as net exports and the trade deficit. Alright, so the first thing I want you to understand is that spending takes place in four sectors of the economy. In other words, the idea is that we can divide the economy into four sectors. There is the household sector, the business sector, the government sector, and the foreign sector. Now what I want to show you is a table that relates the type of spending that corresponds to each of these four sectors. So in the case of the household sector, the official name of the spending that takes place in the household sector is referred to as personal consumption expenditures. Its short name is consumption, and oftentimes I'm going to use the symbol C to stand for consumption, or household spending. There's the business sector, that's the second sector. And the official title of the spending that takes place in the business sector is gross private domestic investment. It's called investment for short, and we use the symbol I to stand for it. Third is government purchases of goods and services, or the formal name is government consumption expenditures and gross investment. The short name is government, and the symbol is G. There's a couple important points I want to make about government purchases of goods and services. The first point, we're talking about purchases, goods, and services. We're not talking about total government spending. In other words, this does not include transfer payments such as Social Security. The second point I want to make is not only does this include federal purchases of goods and services, but it also includes purchases of goods and services by state and local governments as well. All right, on to the fourth sector, the foreign sector. The official title of spending in the foreign sector is net exports of goods and services. Called net exports for short, and we use the term X. And again, an important point to understand about net exports is that it's the difference between export spending, in other words, the difference between the value of the goods and services we ship abroad, and import spending, which is the value of the goods and services that produced abroad that we consume domestically. All right. Let's take a look at this relationship between output and spending. And before you is an equation that I think is very important, and we're going to see throughout the rest of the semester. Another way of thinking about this is the sources and use. Think of this as in terms of sources and use. The source of the goods and services that we buy is our output, and that's what GDP is. And GDP is absorbed by the four sectors that I just mentioned: the household sector, the business sector, the government sector, and the foreign sector. So GDP is equal to consumption spending plus investment spending plus purchases of goods and services by the government, or government purchases of goods and services, as well as net exports. Oftentimes we want to be compact about this relationship, so what I'm showing you is we can, instead of writing it out as GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government plus net exports, it can be written compactly as Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X. All right. Now what I want to do is talk about the four spending components in more detail. So I want to talk about consumption. And when we talk about consumption spending, we're going to find out that consumption spending can be broken down into what's referred to as durables and non-durable consumer goods, as well as services. When I talk about investment, in other words, spending by the business sector, it turns out that investment can be broken into capital spending, that's for plant and equipment, intellectual property products, I'll have more to say about that, residential construction, and residential construction is like houses, single-family homes, apartment buildings, and condominiums. And finally, another component of investment spending is known as inventory investment, which is your change in the stock of inventories. Net exports can be broken down into exports as well as imports. And government purchases, not expenditures, like I just said, we're only interested in purchases of goods and services and not in transfer payments, can be broken down into federal purchases for defense reasons, other federal purchases of goods and services, and also purchases of goods and services by state and local governments. Okay, let's take a look at consumer spending in a little more detail. By a durable good, I'm talking about a good that lasts 3 years or more, and mainly this would include motor vehicles and appliances. Non-durable consumer goods are goods that are used up quickly. The examples that come to mind are food, gasoline, and household supplies. Also, clothing is a non-durable good. Now, it's interesting because clothing is one of these goods that are in between a non-durable and a durable. Maybe the people who decided to include clothing under the non-durable sector had growing kids in the house. All right, and also we have what are referred to as services. This is very important because services include housing, utilities, transportation, medical, and recreation. What's interesting is the issue associated with housing services. And what this rent equivalency basis means is, well, first of all, what this statement is saying, this last statement is saying is, how do you measure housing services? What's used is not mortgage payments, but basically implicit or implied rents. In other words, the idea, if you own a house, you're renting it to yourself, and the value, and the amount of this implied rent is counted as housing services. So if I own my own home, and let's tell a story that to rent a similar home would cost, I don't know, let's say $1,000 a month, then that's the value of the housing services. In other words, my house is providing me with $1,000 worth of value every month. All right, moving on, let's talk about investment spending. Investment spending can be broken down into 4 categories. There's capital spending, intellectual property, residential investment, and inventory investment. Let's take a look at capital spending in more detail. That includes producers' durables equipment, and under producer durables equipment comes information processing, which includes computers, telecommunications. And then we have industrial equipment and transportation equipment, which includes leased cars, and other types of equipment, such as equipment related to natural resources, such as agricultural equipment, that would be like a combine, or mining equipment, construction equipment, office equipment. And then you have non-residential construction that would include buildings, utilities, oil drilling, most roads, and most roads in the public sector. Now, the third type of investment spending is intellectual property, and intellectual property includes software, research and development, as well as entertainment, literary, and artistic originals. It's interesting because if I was giving this lecture in 2012, intellectual property would not be included. Software, I believe, would fall under the equipment, business equipment rubric from the previous slide, but research and development, entertainment, literary, and artistic originals would not be included in GDP. Up to a year ago, these last 2 items, research and development, entertainment, literary, and artistic originals, were considered to be intermediate goods. But now, based on further thought, they are now considered to be final goods. So the amount of money spent on research and development, or the amount of money spent on entertainment, now counts towards GDP, and obviously also the amount of money spent on software. Also, third, we have, or fourth I should say, third or fourth, whatever, we have investment or residential construction. This includes new single-family homes, multifamily homes, major additions and alterations. So if you add on, push your house out to the south of or if you add on a bedroom or a new kitchen or whatever, that counts as a residential investment. Brokerage commissions, So the idea is that the construction of a new home is recorded to the GDP at the time it is built, and at the time that the house is purchased, only the brokerage commission is included in GDP. Finally, we have what is referred to as inventory investment, which is the change in the stock of inventories. The general idea is that not all newly produced goods and services are sold. In other words, remember what the definition of GDP is. It's the value of your total output of final goods and services. But not all the goods and services produced in a given period of time are necessarily sold. So we need sort of like a catch-all for all these items that are produced but not yet sold, and we would call that inventory investment. And again, that's the change in your stock of inventories over time. And it turns out about 1%. Inventory investment makes up about 1% of GDP, but accounts for more than 50% of the fluctuations in real GDP during recessions. Now what I want to talk about is intermediate goods and services. These are mostly parts and materials used in the production of final goods. For example, steel for autos, lumber for housing, natural gas for petrochemicals, office supplies, but not capital equipment. Some intermediate services as well. Here's one that you might find interesting. If you go on a business trip, the airline travel counts as an intermediate good and not as a final good. So the money that goes to airline travel is counted as an intermediate and doesn't show up in GDP. On the other hand, if I on the other hand was sitting next to you on the flight and I'm going on vacation, then the amount of money that I'm spending for that flight does count towards GDP because the purpose is for a final good. My pleasure. Okay. Government purchases of goods and services. This would include purchases of goods and services at the federal, state, and local level. And the interesting thing is that the majority of government purchases of goods and services is at the state and local level. And if you think about it, that makes sense because that's where most of your education spending takes place. Spending for libraries, spending for law enforcement, spending for your court system, spending for roads. And also, an important point to understand is that roughly around 2/3 of the purchases of goods and services by the federal government is defense related. Now remember, what I'm talking about is purchases of goods and services and not transfer payments. Alright, the last thing I want to talk about is net exports of goods and services. Net exports is the difference between exports and imports, and when imports are greater than exports, there's a trade deficit and net exports are negative. When exports are greater than imports, we have a surplus and net exports are positive. The interesting thing is that roughly since 1976, the U.S. has consistently run a trade deficit. All right, that wraps up my discussion about the spending approach at GDP. And in my next presentation, I'm going to show you what's currently happening to the various components of spending that are included in GDP. Until then.